You see a ridiculous opener like this, and the common confusion stems from one or two things. Why is the lead up to the start of the fight so ridiculously long? Why is that even important? And why is it that this supposedly maximum damage opener spends the first 7 seconds kind of doing nothing? There's literally cooldowns just burning in your pockets all this time. Why on earth would that be most efficient? In this video, I will use 4 examples to try and explain the point of all the strangeness that stems from openers, as well as what makes different openers better for different situations, so you can feel properly equipped to understand whether you need an optimal opener for what it is you like to do in the game, or whether going with the flow or even a specialized opener is what you require to do your best. Now, let's start with the question, why do openers tend to hold back for the first few seconds of a fight? To answer that, let's take a look at the standard warrior opener. The first thing standing out is that upheaval is delayed a solid 10 seconds into the fight alongside onslaught. Both of these are easily explained by wanting to delay them to benefit from Storm's Eye. However, if it was just about that, then you could just as well have used them immediately and on average get a third extra cast of each of them per fight, which is better than having them do 10% more damage on the first cast. The second weird thing is that, technically, you could weave in a release after Heavy Swing if you wanted to, and postpone Primal Rend and Inner Chaos to after the Fell Cleaves, and then Inner Release would be ready again a little sooner next time. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, for the Inner Release part, this is actually a specific type of alternative opener that sometimes comes up for specific fight optimizations, but anyway. The reason why these things are delayed in this way is because a lot of jobs take around 3 to 4 GCDs to get ready to burst, Warrior being no exception, and this means that most optimized openers simply plan around this timing. This means that you can expect buffs to come out right around when Storm's Eye is cast, give or take a second or two in either direction. As some buffs come out sooner and some later, it is safest to lead with your biggest attacks if you can, as the first few seconds of the burst tends to be the Eye of the Storm, where all of the buffs tend to align most effectively. This is why Inner Chaos and Primal Rend are prioritized so highly, as it comes at no cost to the warrior, as you still have time to use Fell Cleaves as you need. The second part is that raid buffs, depending on how many you get and how well they align, can buff the damage of, say, Upheaval by 20%. Combined with Storm's Eye's own damage bonus leads to a 32% boost, which on its own still isn't more than a third of an extra upheaval for using it quickly. However, on top of this, every 4th upheaval will naturally align with raid buffs as long as it comes out on cooldown after this, meaning that this value is added every time raid buffs come out. And it only requires you to delay it once, and getting this bonus more than once is more valuable than a third of an extra upheaval. This also applies to Onslaught. Regarding using Inner Release early, while you could do that, raid buffs will, assuming no inconvenient downtimes, come out every 2 minutes, right around when Inner Release comes out anyway, and having it 5 seconds sooner does not benefit you in any way for this alignment. A common exception is if there are boss mechanics getting in the way of your opener or bursts in the fight. Then alternative openers concentrating damage a bit more or front-loading it more can sometimes be beneficial. But, generally, the opener aligns all of your big damage buttons with everyone else's raid buff cooldowns. The second example aims to explain why some jobs rely on unreasonably long pull timers for their openers. A relatively simple one is the Dancer's standard opener. Why do you need to use standard step 15 seconds in advance for the opener? Simply put, standard step does a decent amount of damage, but overall isn't impressive enough to actively ensure it lands in raid buffs every time, as its 4 to 5 second full cast time makes its damage more comparable to a slightly better 6-sided star, which is also not very impressive. When you use standard step, the cooldown begins. However, you have up to 15 seconds to do the steps, and then use standard finish, which means this 15-second lead up means you get an additional standard step in your actual opener because of this. Again, overall, Dancer doesn't care enough about standard step to actively make sure it lands in every burst, but if it happens to do so anyway, it isn't a bad thing. Only a few jobs have these kinds of long openers, and each have their own unique reasons for doing it that way. The third example is about how some jobs have different openers depending on their group composition. Summoner, for instance, has 2 different common openers depending on whether their group has at least 2 jobs with short raid buffs or not. The reason for this is that Slipstream does slightly more total damage than a single set of Topaz Ride Mountain Buster, and once raid buffs run out, it doesn't actually matter which order you use your attacks in, they will do their damage just the same. However, if raid buffs last longer overall, then Topaz Ride Mountain Buster is about 25% stronger than Emerald Ride in terms of potency per second. Now, those are some examples to showcase how different jobs deal with openers and what it means for them. However, in a real fight, the boss doesn't always just take it and sometimes becomes untargetable for a while. In a real fight, your group might not actually align buffs as cleanly as it sounds. In a real fight, especially in more casual content, there won't be a pull timer. In these situations, often, openers serve more as a structured approach to getting everything on cooldown in a nice orderly manner, and for some jobs, getting a proper opener is still good just to make it all fit during your own damage buffs. Dragoon, Ninja and Monk comes to mind as some examples of this. That is to say, if you main a Dancer for example, but you mainly play casual content where pull timers don't really happen, following the standard opener is still an option, but obviously you won't get to use standard step 15 seconds in advance, and you will have to adapt around it. Similarly, for jobs that have less buffs of their own, adapting your rotation depending on what you get can also be effective. Instead of a warrior leading with both Inner Chaos casts and Primal Rend immediately, you can use the Fell Cleaves after the first Inner Chaos to delay until more players use their raid buffs. Well, if they even bother, but it's worth a shot. This is better than blindly following an opener and rotation when the rest of the group isn't aligning with you anyway. With that said, possibly the most anomalous job in this regard is Machinist. At the moment, it has two common openers. The General Raid opener and the opener formerly known as the Heavy Buff Alignment opener, now known as the Delayed Tools opener. Now, if you take a really close look at these two openers, you'll find that the only difference between the two openers is precisely when the first reassemble is used and when air anchor is used. What difference does that even make? Quite a bit, actually. In the general purpose opener, this part here is actually replaced by an extra hypercharge window in the 2-minute burst. Meanwhile, the best the Delayed Tools opener can do in comparison is to place an extra hypercharge window after the drill at the end of the burst, because, and this might come as a shock, but assuming there is no lost GCD in the full 2 minutes, then the opener sequence plays precisely the same in the 2-minute burst as in the opener, with the only difference being that you might have heat and battery gauge leading into the burst itself. What does that then mean for the damage of the openers? Well, obviously, the reason why the Delayed Tools opener postpones air anchor is to place it within raid buffs. Assuming the standard we did earlier, raid buffs will tend to come out at this point, between Slugshot and Clean Shot. This means that, compared to the general raid opener, Clean Shot is replaced with a guaranteed critical directed air anchor, and that is the only difference in the opener. Every 2 minutes, the other difference is that the general raid opener will fit more heat blasts during raid buffs, and Delayed Tools find space for air anchor. How much this actually matters isn't that much. The Delayed Tools opener gains a very slightly higher benefit from raid buffs compared to the general raid opener. However, the general raid opener gets its first air anchor in a solid 10 seconds sooner, and the first reassemble 15 seconds sooner. Sound familiar? What this means is that, assuming whichever opener and rotation you choose to roll with goes on uninterrupted from start to finish in a fight, there's a 10 to 15 second gap every 40 seconds where the general raid opener is objectively slightly stronger than the Delayed Tools, simply because it has been able to fire its air anchor, but Delayed Tools has not. Depending on how many raid buffs your group has, and of course how well the buffs actually align, the benefit of delaying the initial air anchor may be very small. Not to mention, every 2-minute burst after that, the general raid opener is getting around 3 heat blasts, compared to Delayed Tools 1-3 combo step plus air anchor without reassemble, making the power difference significantly smaller too. So now you might be sitting there thinking, alright Kai, we get it, you clearly have a favorite opener among these two, just spill the beans, which one is it? And the answer to that is neither. Sure, I tend to use the general raid one more myself, but that is mainly because I mostly play Machinist in content where my group is unreliable, making the value of the Delayed Tools opener far less impactful. I also tend to teach this opener more, which is because specialized openers that take some sort of loss, delaying air anchor for a specialized benefit, more raid buff damage, should mainly be used if you know why you're using it. Ultimately, the damage difference between the two openers and rotations is going to be so small that what really matters is that you play a rotation that you are comfortable performing while boss mechanics are flying around your ears without making a mistake. And sure, if the boss dies just before the raid buff window, then General Raid has that early air anchor advantage. But again, this assumes that you were never stopped from attacking, which isn't always the case. As long as an opener and rotation actually uses all of your cooldowns efficiently and as often as possible, the precise damage difference between one or the other is going to be surprisingly small in most cases. Which is to say that you could invent a third completely different opener and rotation for Machinist, and as long as the cooldowns are used in a somewhat logical fashion, and at least land somewhat within the common raid buff windows, it is going to be about as good as these two common ones. And all this, of course, also applies for any other job too. These 4 examples are shown as 4 jobs that have openers and rotations that showcase something very specific about openers and rotations. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, with enough raid buffs and individual buffs from jobs like Dancer, a single job could have a burst window easily doing over 50% more damage on average. Try taking a look at some of your job tooltips and imagine it just doing 50% more damage than that simply because you chose to use it at the right time. While it is a bit dated, I actually have a video where I go into more detail calculating all this, which you can find here if you're interested.